Good afternoon, and welcome back to your afternoon 5-State Farm Report. Daniel Drotzman, your host here for 570 WNAX. Thanks for tuning in here today on this Tuesday, and hope you guys are all having a great day so far. Well, kicking off your program here today with a special guest we are excited to welcome on. Visiting here today with Mary Drewnoski. She is a Nebraska Extension Beef System Specialist. And Mary, thanks for joining us here on WNAX. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing all right, and I'm happy to be able to join you today.
Absolutely. Well, we're excited to have you on. So I guess we've been hearing a lot about the conditions in Nebraska, and I guess just the concern for quality grazing. So, I mean, anything you have been hearing specifically from farmers or ranchers about grazing this year and just some of the conditions in Nebraska?
Well, yeah, I think the big thing is that the overwhelming majority of Nebraska is currently in extreme drought. Now, this past week we have gotten quite a bit of rain in some areas, and that might make people, think that all the problems are solved. However, that would not be true. So, depending on where you're at in Nebraska, we either have, majority cool season base, it's like in the eastern part of the state, and then as you go into the central, we kind of have a mix, mostly warm season, and then in the west, again, it'll be a mix, but a lot more warm season grasses. Now, this rain that we just currently got will be useful for those areas that got it and have those warm season grasses. They will be able to respond as long as people have been treating their pastures right, meaning a lot of them, and I've seen a lot, I just drove through western Nebraska this weekend actually, and there were still a lot of cows being fed hay in a sacrifice area, and that really is the right thing to do when we were in such dry conditions is not put them out to utilize what little growth was there. So I'm happy to see that. I mean, of course, I'm sad that it has to be, but I am glad that people, know how to manage to try to take care of their pastures, and hopefully that we'll get some response there. In the eastern part of the state, however, which is mostly cool seasons, we're basically already too warm for the pasture to respond a whole lot. And in fact, we had a lot of our brome that was heading out at 6 inches tall, when normally it might be 12 to 15 when we would start seeing that. So I would say, while we aren't in a severe drought as the rest of the state, we kind of don't have the rain at the right time, and so we're kind of seeing the consequences of that. So what do we do, right? What do we tell producers to do? Well, number one, of course, is not utilize those pastures if they're not ready to be grazed. So seeing a lot of people feeding cows. In fact, I've done quite a few confinement cow rations, so rations for those lactating cows, because that's another thing to recognize is that everybody's used to feeding dry cows. And lactating cows have a much higher energy and protein requirement, and so meeting those needs is not as simple as feeding them hay and maybe a little bit of cake. Usually you need quite a bit of supplement to get to where you need them to meet their needs. So then, breeding's coming up very soon as well. We got to have them ready for that.
Absolutely. And I guess, there's also any specific recommendations that kind of come to mind just for cattle producers when talking about these conditions. I know sometimes like stocking rates or just rotating frequently can be beneficial, or, even is it a possibility to go in and seed more grass? Just any specific recommendations?
Yeah, so a few things. Like I said, the first one is not to get on it too early. A lot of people have been looking at culling cows to get their stocking rate down, and I think that is, always a good option, so you can have some lower stocking rates. If you are in a situation where you can rotationally graze, then, if the conditions are particularly dry, one of the things to recognize is the grasses are not going to regrow very fast. And so instead of intensifying the rotation, actually it's going to be more of a use your half, move to the next one, and you're likely not going to come back because that grass is not going to recover as quickly. And so early weaning is another option to try to basically reduce those needs of that lactating cow, still get her bred, and basically get again, reduce the stocking rate a bit. And so I'm sure that there are some people who are going to be considering that this year. So that's another opportunity to reduce stocking rate without decreasing your cow herd numbers as much. And then the other thing I do want to mention here is that we can think about also trying to use alternative forages. So had a lot of questions this year, especially with the wildfires that we had in the state here. There were some people who, neighbors said, hey, I won't plant corn on this pivot if you want to do annual forages. And that's another option. And right now, while most of those crops are in, there is an opportunity to think about, this fall and cover crops, especially after corn silage as an option, even high moisture corn if you're in the central part of the state, if you can find people who are taking that out and go ahead and plant a cover crop, which for those if you're looking for fall forage, what we're really looking at is, something like oats or a brassica that'll bring up some early growth and be able to graze that this fall. Or, of course, we can always go by the old standby, something like rye, wheat, or triticale that's going to overwinter. Not going to give you a lot of fall forage, but will give you some spring forage to give those pastures that maybe you do overuse a little bit this year a break, especially in that early spring period next year. The thing about drought is that it is not a one-year phenomenon, I think, as everybody knows. So what we do this year affects next year, and we really got to think about recovery of those plants. So those fields that you happen, those pastures that you happen to maybe utilize a little bit harder this year, think about how do I give them a break, and in particular, how to give them a break during the period that the plants I really want to be there are growing. So like if it's a predominantly warm season, definitely not hitting them hard at the end of May and early June, so that they have an opportunity to really get established before you come in and graze them maybe later in the season.
Gotcha. Some good tips there. Well, last but not least, I guess, is there any specific research that you're currently working on that would maybe be interesting to our listeners?
Oh, of course, I think all the research I'm working on is interesting to our listeners. But there's a couple of things related to this particular topic, one of which is that I've actually been doing these annual forage systems for about 3 years now, looking at producing cow-calf pairs on annuals alone, so rye followed by Sudan. And I will say that while, of course, it is a bit higher cost than our perennial pastures, my math actually looks pretty good for it because our calves are actually a little bit heavier coming off of it. So it is a system that looks, especially right now with calf prices, very economically viable. So that's a really nice thing. And the other thing that I'll mention is when we're thinking about drought, and we have to think about vitamin A. And so forages that are not green do not have a lot of beta-carotene, which is basically how our cows get vitamin A. And while I'm not really particularly worried about this breeding season because they likely will have had enough vitamin A to get bred because doesn't take a whole lot, what I do want to have our producers are thinking about is what they're going to do this winter. Because if we don't have a lot of lush green forage this summer and fall, then those cows basically are going to be using their stores up, and we get to calving, and then that's where we're going to have a problem because the calf is really dependent on the cow to provide all the vitamin A that calf's going to get through the colostrum. And that is really important for basically their immune system. In particular, calves who don't have enough vitamin A, they get diarrhea, respiratory diseases. So a lot of those early calfhood diseases that we see can be basically influenced by vitamin A because it impacts essentially the integrity of the gut and the lungs. So bottom line is, thinking forward here, this winter we want to make sure we are supplementing at least 7,500 international units of vitamin A for our cows during that last part of gestation, so those last 3 months. So a little bit higher supplementation rate than most people would be normally providing, and that's because I suspect that those cows are going to come in and they're not going to have as good a stores, and we want to make sure that that diet is well fortified so that that calf gets what it needs.
Gotcha. Very, very interesting for sure. So I guess, did I miss anything or anything to wrap up on or leave our listeners with?
I mean, the last thing I would say, I guess, is that, of course, Extension, whether it be Nebraska Extension or other state Extension offices, we're always here to try to help. And so, if producers are thinking about, I have this situation, I'm trying to figure out what I do, I don't have grass, or I'm worried about, utilizing this grass because of what effects it might have on the grass, give us a call, right? We'll talk through options and opportunities and help you think through your situation. We know everybody's situation is different, and there isn't one right answer, and so you got to think about what are all the opportunities that you may have and all of the difficulties that you may have, and we figure out what might be the best option.
All right, perfect. Again, that's Mary Drewnoski. She is Nebraska Extension Beef Systems Specialist, joining us here today on your afternoon 5-State Farm Report. Well, with that, we'll take a quick break. We'll take a look at some ag weather, and then here at the bottom of the hour, we'll take a look at your markets and round out your Tuesday market day. So stay tuned to 570 WNAX. I'm Danielle Drotzman.